So with our panel of experts, one of the things that's always important is creating the interactive part of this. And such an intimate group, it shouldn't be tough to ask them some of the questions. The flavor of the day is, what is the future of data centers, whether it's modular or not? How do you attract customers and or sell your goods and services? And how would these experts help you with your needs? So with that, one of the questions that I would ask is somebody, Bill, when you have a question specific to your company's needs growing in the future, do you think that some of the presentations and ideas that you've seen so far are going to help, hurt, change? I mean, does that, in the next 3 years, which is a long time in the data center world, dynamically change the direction of Disney? Do you think you're going to go to? And how can?
If I tell you, I have to kill you. No, I'm kidding.
And so with that, ask any one of them directly, and you can point it to any questions.
Well, I have no problem with that. Let me think about that for a minute.
Okay. Maybe Michelle and or Manon, with the services you see today, as it's becoming more and more difficult for enterprise users that don't know the intricacies of the data center market as well as you guys do. How do you individually help customers with their sourcing needs and their requirements internally and externally? And I'll start with you, Michelle.
So hopefully everybody knows a little bit about my background and where I come from. So if I can, I'll just take a step back. And that I used to be, for the last 4 years or so, working with an organization that did a lot of brokering, and with the stress in the data center environment. Not only that, was pulled through business on the network side as well. So that's where I come from. And then prior to that, many, many years in the carrier direct side. So I was on carrier direct, moved to indirect, and now I'm independent and consulting side, not working for anybody but myself at this point. And I harness a ton of resources on the technical level, and I sit down with organizations to talk about the high-level discussion around their business initiatives. So with that, Tim, I really speak to a lot of understanding exactly what the client is looking for, trying to find out the dependencies, and the direction of the organization. I like to go in, clean up the messiness, and then that will usually fuel their new initiative. But as far as determining how they go through the selection process and understanding the intricacies of the data center, it's really important to understand where they're trying to get, where they're at today, and understanding that baseline, and then where they're trying to get, and then fitting the right solution to that. So it's really a lot of qualifying, a lot of understanding exactly the needs of the client in order to find an applicable solution. Because it may be data center, it may be cloud, it may be data center, and you just never know. So I'll turn it over to Manon to answer the other half of the question.
Same question. Hi, my name is Manon Buettner, and I'm the principal and founder of Nuvalo. And similarly to Michelle, I have a 15-year plus background in the telecom, network, IP, IT space. And now I offer consulting and brokerage services around colocation and cloud computing. And so to echo what Michelle was saying, really is not a hard and fast answer one way or the other which direction companies are going to take. So typically the process that I follow is to start with a baseline asset inventory, a needs assessment, and essentially work through a total cost of ownership analysis so that clients are understanding which applications are best suited. It becomes very clear which applications are best suited for a colo or a cloud model, and then we can put some processes in place to basically chart the migration path over the next 3-year period of time. Did that answer all the questions, Tim?
I have a question. You said applications. Which applications are best suited for the cloud versus colo? Are you talking about?
Well, at a high level, cloud really is meeting the purpose of bursty, unpredictable traffic applications. So if you have a seasonal website or if you've got test dev application where you're still trying to define your requirements, your bandwidth requirements, your compute and storage requirements, if you're a startup organization that's still trying to figure that out, anywhere where companies are looking to deploy mass scale servers for a short period of time. So there are a lot of different situations where cloud computing would come into play, but in my particular response, what I was referring to was, if once you take a look at what your applications cost you internally in terms of the hardware and the software and the licensing and the support and the management systems and the facilities and all of the peripheral costs that go into keeping these, and then balance that against what your initiatives are in terms of increasing your competitive advantage and driving the cost out of IT by outsourcing some of your just IT requirements that are not core to your business. It becomes fairly obvious as you go through the exercise which ones are best suited, and you can pull through based on where the interdependencies are, how to lump them into silos and start planning to move them out that way.
Can I add to that for a moment?
So for context, my name is Bryan Thompson. I come from a company called Tier 3. We're a cloud platform provider, so this is obviously something that's near and dear to me. One of the things I would just add to that is there are actually multiple flavors of the cloud. So when you look at what applications are well suited to move to a cloud, am I looking for private cloud within my own infrastructure that I'm managing? Am I looking for pure IaaS public cloud? Am I looking for more managed services on top of that, or additional security layers? So I think there's a number of different assessments, and I'm sure you go through the same type of program in helping customers look at their existing infrastructure, look at their existing workloads, and identify what are conducive to moving out there. There are those core kind of day-to-day types of systems that maybe there's no value or added value for you to manage yourselves, therefore they're very conducive to move out into the cloud and let somebody else take care of that. There are applications where I have bursting or kind of spikes or ebbs and flows in my traffic where I can take better economic advantage of that elasticity afforded in the cloud. And yet I have other applications where I may have security requirements and or special needs that it just can't go there. I need to manage in my own facility. So you have these kind of concepts of hybrid cloud type of experiences where I can seamlessly move things between the two or leverage best of both. So I think there's no easy one-size-fits-all answer. But
so in the hybrid model, when you have database in your infrastructure and you're using web services in the cloud, how big of a deal is latency now?
very good question. So from a latency perspective, and this is really where it kind of comes into play, is how are those applications architected? How are can they survive latency? And or what type of a hybrid cloud experience can you leverage? One of the things, not to go from a pitch, but a lot of these companies, you'll see Amazon actually even recently made an announcement that they'll support direct connects or leverage Equinix's Ethernet exchange. So where you can do connections between those physical or hosted systems as well as leveraging those cloud environments, where I can do things such as leveraging not just security from like a VPN tunnel, but truly doing direct connect, cross connect, MPLS type of connections where I can reduce latency. Then I'm able to leverage a commodity layer that can be scaled horizontally or leverage that elasticity while keeping the core application or database layer within those environments. So again, it really depends on the application itself and how it's architected, how it will perform in those latent type of scenarios. But oftentimes either between distributing that concept where you can have kind of a tiered hierarchy or leveraging caching and or some type of direct connect and true hybrid type of a model, you're able to provide and power those types of systems.
From a colo perspective, what is your take, I'll throw it to the panel, what is your take from the parking lot perspective, from an IT parking lot perspective, where all the infrastructure is provided, obviously in a modular fashion, but what's your take on that? Do you think that's a good thing, bad thing, or something that's going to grow or die?
Well, let's let Don answer that because I'm sure he has a thought.
Yeah. I loaded it up for you now.
Well, I don't want to revisit my presentation if I can avoid that. But there are some interesting concepts, and actually one thing I really enjoyed listening to Tim talk about was what what I'm wrestling with on a daily basis with, and on trying to help customers work out the latest deals with TC 9.9 and the expanded ASHRAE interpretations, if you will, is not what he's necessarily dealing with. And so the drivers that are going, pushing things forward are interesting. One of the things that I struggle with, and I don't know how much the others here struggle with, is what will next year's legislation bring? And you know, a year ago, as the economy improves, you kind of wonder, are they going to start passing more of that greenhouse gas stuff? And when the economy goes down, then you go, no one's going to have the cojones to pass greenhouse gas stuff. But what that affects in the future of how colos exist is if you're going to all of a sudden be in an environment where you have to be more efficient, because not just because it was the good thing to do the OpEx, but because there'll be additional taxes applied to your business model. I imagine that drives you batty in terms of trying to anticipate that, unless, and I don't know, is that an issue? And going back to what you're talking about, the parking lot model or modularity, and I don't know how, I think I derailed your question here.
Sorry, I'll bring it back.
But we do see some colos liking it. It's still, as much as I talked about, you know, it's the way of the future, it's still not a dominant force. So will it catch on? Maybe one of the others want to talk.
Hi, my name is Chris Turnley. I'm with Iron Mountain. What we see when we work, because we work with kind of across the spectrum globally of colo providers and then people that are doing their own, I think people still struggle with getting back to what do I want to deal with, and one of the panelists mentioned, what do I want to deal with is core to what I do, and what do I want to push off to somebody else? And pushing out to someone else can be a cloud, or it can be a colo, it can be an outsourced provider totally, depending on the size of your organization. So I still think we struggle, and when I say we, and this is Iron Mountain as a business, because we manage about 18 to 20 petabytes of data in our data center and replicate often. So I talk to our engineers about, you know, what do we do, what do we think about, and we still struggle with, you know, what's core to us versus what can we put off to somebody else. And I think as I look at colos and going back to your question, that's what I think service. So with all the change, I would be more like, all right, give me my non-core stuff and let me put that onto somebody else, because then they're assuming the liability. They're trying to keep their people up to certain specifications, and let them fix it. And I want to treat it more and more like a utility. I want to treat all those things that are non-core, that are non-data, like utility and pace models, and say, you keep up to the latest specs. I don't want to do that anymore. I want to keep the core data that I want to manage, and I want to push that out. So I think where I look at colos and seeing them, as you look at their technologies, and I see them grow more and more, whether it's modular or they're investing in more brick and mortar buildings, I still see businesses wanting to use them more for that flex. And again, I draw less a distinction between what happens in the cloud and what happens in a colo, because it's not happening in my building. So all things that don't happen in my building, I can hold you accountable to my SLA and to those specifications we sign in the contract that you agree you're going to keep up to, and then I don't have to do it anymore. And I think businesses, that's what we're seeing our businesses go more and more towards, and so that's going to drive, I would think, what you guys are looking at is them coming to you and me saying, I may hold my colo provider more accountable to being up to spec in those areas than I have to, and then I can cut out a lot of that from what we're looking at from a compliance standpoint.
So let me follow up on that a little bit with some of the recent, let's call it high-profile outages that have occurred in certain cloud providers. We'll go nameless. Nobody from there here today, I don't think. Losing the compute functionality is one thing. Losing the data that goes behind it certainly is another. Now, if we have this hybrid cloud with the ability to connect, certainly that makes my responsibility as a data owner clear. I own the core data. You don't touch it. You just run compute for me. Certainly that makes it a little more palatable for me as a customer, for example, to say, put some of my computing out in the cloud, but I'm not going to put my data out there. There's also other pieces of that having to do with things like PCI, PII, HIPAA, yada, 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 all of the regulatory alphabet soup that we all have to deal with in some respect or another. That lets me keep control over that data and maintain it and be able to say to the auditor, here's where the data lives, as opposed to saying, it lives out there somewhere. But getting back to this, how do you respond, how do you deal with the challenges with companies that have these very public outages that you're trying to get out there and sell and promote and broker?
So thank you, first of all, for stealing the thunder of my presentation that's forthcoming.
Oh, sorry.
But this is a really key component that I feel strongly about, because I talk to CIOs and CFOs all the time, and what I found is that after the April 1st event and since then, conversations that I was having about, how to start looking at migrating services and presenting business cases to have, executive management sign off on these migrations, it really seemed to halt. And it was all because there's a perception that all cloud computing is like Amazon, or like, the PlayStation outage, or, name it, right? So I think there's still such a great deal of education that has to go into talking about, well, what are your actual requirements? What are you trying to solve for? Are you trying to move to cloud just because you heard you need to get some, or because there really is a financial driver that says your CFO or your organization doesn't want to be in this CapEx cycle, that your equipment in whatever infrastructure is, end of life, it's not supported, and that there are other ways that you want to look at moving that out. So you really have to define, are you trying to solve, what problems you're trying to solve for. So with that being said, the second half of that is, IT is IT. There's outages that happen every day, everywhere, that you never hear about, of course, because they just aren't public. They're not in the public eye. And it's really, the onus is on, the IT organization to build and architect an environment that's going to meet your business requirements and your uptime requirements. And if that means putting it in 2 locations, then great. If that means putting it with 2 cloud providers, then you got to do that. But the businesses own the responsibility and the uptime, and pointing the finger at one provider or saying that one provider is just like all the other providers is an absolute misconception.
Okay, but that's what's publicly seen,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the problem.
And one at a time, I will gradually dispel all of those myths.
Fair enough.
Did you want to add?
Just a couple kind of quick comments. One thing is just in full transparency. So I worked for said bookseller for many years. In fact, I still have a tattoo, if you want to see it. The recent public events, we, within our company, we've been around for several years, but we look at cloud itself and cloud adoption, that we still think we're in the first inning of this ballgame, right? It's still early on. So things that happen to Amazon, well, in certain contexts we compete with them, it's bad for this industry because there's a market perception, it shakes confidence and wariness, and slows adoption, right? The same challenges that you ran into where these conversations come to a halt. We face those same challenges. That being said, it's also an education component too, where the cloud doesn't mean that you don't have to worry about your own kind of risk mitigation or architecting your systems. If you have critical systems that need to be highly available, great. You need to help architect that and leverage the cloud in an appropriate way to do that. You mentioned a couple key components around PII. If I have other entities or compliance requirements, how do I control the scope of how I'm using the cloud such that I can attain PCI compliance or HIPAA compliance? So working with providers, and I think the other opportunity is even as service providers, to provide transparency into those systems, processes, etc. Coming from said bookseller, I can tell you in the past, as they've opened up to third-party technology platforms, even when they opened up to third-party merchants selling through the platform, they were intentionally vague with releasing events or exposure to that. That was all closed door. I think they've taken phenomenal strides. They still don't have the full transparency, but even this event from last week, they provide a fairly detailed kind of what they would call internally a COE or correction of errors document, ironically point out saying, wow, really? One system caused that failure and
Yeah.
lost
Oh,
data?
yeah.
How is that
Exactly.
acceptable?
Exactly.
So I guarantee there's some people that don't work there anymore. But that being said, what happens to them I think is bad and damaging for the industry because they are such a market leader
Oh, yeah.
in that kind of early
Very
drive.
visible. And that hurts them.
Yeah.
I kind of have a question on this. I'm kind of I guess, a data center outsider. I'm a security company, and so as I look at Amazon, candidly, AWS has one of the most robust security teams globally. Fantastic talent. And so you look at that, and it's, what separates them, or you guys, from them? I mean, is it just a case like, holy crap, I'm glad that wasn't us? Or is it, we have these practices in place that make it so this would never happen to us?
Sure. So speaking from my organization, one of the things that Amazon has to do is they have to build the multi-tenant apartment that can scale to house tens of thousands of different customers, which means there are aspects of their system that has to be absolutely hardened in one size fits all, which also implies inherent inflexibility in certain areas. As a smaller provider going after a different niche market, if you will, we're not focusing on meeting the demands of Netflix or the next Zynga or Facebook gaming platform. More focusing on the needs of an enterprise who wants to extend mission critical applications to a back office. You're able to provide a lot more high touch service, and while it's still designed for multi-tenancy and you're living within those frameworks of commonalities that you're building through that, there's a lot more opportunity to tailor customers' environments. Controlling where data resides to specific spindles if you need to. So you're almost going down that route of dedicated infrastructure while still leveraging the economies of kind of a public cloud infrastructure. So I think it depends on the business model and your ability to support that.
So I guess what I don't know if I'm hearing this correct, but AWS is for an attacker is low-hanging fruit. In the industry, we're starting to see more and more of a shift from the Fortune 500 organizations, large organizations, into the attacks being done in the SMB market. And so I don't know if it's just like, oh, you know what, they're so big that they're going to get hit. I mean, it's like maybe I like baseball, so if you were to ask me, can I name the guys on the 25-man roster of the Mariners, I could do it. Could you tell me 2 names of the guys at the Everett Aqua Sox? I'd be like, I don't know. I'm not even sure what the stadium is. So do you know what I'm saying? I mean, is it just a matter of size?
They're a big target.
Yeah, AWS is a huge.
And I think they have high-profile customers that make those customers targets as well. Yeah, I think that's a challenge that anyone faces, right? Even in the SMB space, I know we worked with a customer, an e-commerce provider, who, while in the grand scheme of e-commerce were a drop in the bucket, they were a high-profile target, especially during holiday season for DDoS attacks, and how do you work with them to help mitigate those? I don't think any size organization is free of that.
No, and I agree with that. Actually, sorry, I don't want to hijack, but I had a question. I talked to Manon, is that correct? A little bit about it. What kind of interested me about coming to this, I had a client that said, we're moving to a data center about 3 months ago, and simply said, whose responsibility is security? Is it the data center's responsibility? Is it our responsibility? And so, kind of said, great question. Let me do a little bit of research. I'd love to hear from the panel, and I'm hoping that the response isn't, well, it depends. So if you guys can give me a little bit more than it depends.
It depends. The answer to the question is who's in charge of security for DDoS attacks is who's the network provider. And then what is the network provider and how does the data touch it? So as an example, as a data center owner operator, we have customers in this data center that do not buy any network effect from us. JP Morgan is one of my customers in here. It's obviously a large bank. Due to the fact that we can't compete at the level, and we're carrier neutral, and sell them data as level 3 and the 5 or 6 other carriers that they buy from, we don't touch any of that part of, so that is not my responsibility.
Data's not yours, okay?
Data is not mine. I have customers in this facility that have 2 and 3 U's and quarter cabinets and racks, and we have applications, we run Force 10 gear, we have multiple routers, et cetera. The data, the security, the DDoS attacks, all that is our responsibility. So when you look at it, it's depends.
Sure, no, I understand.
Right, and the long and short of it is with conscientious customers, high profile, small or otherwise, and we have customers in there that don't consume a lot of space and power, but we see very large DDoS attacks all the time that originate, 14-year-old Finnish kids get bored in the winter, snows there, they have nothing else to do. So we see that quite a bit, and it's our responsibility completely because we have an SLA on that. So.
I think one of the things I think companies need to realize, so if you're working with a client, it's their name's going to end up in the paper, right? I mean, people may care that it's their service provider, or they may care that it's their network provider, but it's your company, right? And so I think what people have to do is going to the cloud or going to a colo provider does not obfuscate you from all the responsibility that your organization is supposed to have. So if the provider you're looking at doesn't live up to the SLAs that you expect, don't do business with them. And I think that's the Amazon issue. I mean, in a lot of cases is if you go into their SLAs, they were designed to do certain things, and your first thing analogy was perfect. They will grow into other things, but people are like, well, I'm gonna just dump it. And I'm like, well, no, because that data has a different SLA than this data does, so we have to get better at knowing what the data is and what we expect it really to do and what we expect that provider to do, because not every provider is gonna do everything, and that's why there's such a multiplicity out in the marketplace. So my answer would be flat out, it's your company. If you're willing to put your company in the hands of somebody else and your company's reputation, you better make sure that they've got that nailed. And accidents are gonna happen, things are gonna happen. Water's gonna spill into, somebody, right? So, but do they respond the way your expectation? So if your expectation is no matter what happens, we're gonna be back up in 2 hours, if you don't have the confidence that your provider is gonna be able to provide the same thing, then don't do business there.
So do your due diligence.
You have to, because at the end of the day, it's your company. And that's how I push back on clients. I would tell them all day long.
Question about? I work with Chris at Iron Mountain. Another thing too is I think that the marketplace is becoming more mature, and we're going to start seeing standards in terms of the cloud and sharing that risk and passing it off via an SLA to your provider. I think those things are coming in the next few years. You're going to see more robust SLAs that are according to industry standards like we see in the network stack and the physical layer, those types of things. They're coming. Gartner's talking about them. If you go online, there's a lot of symposiums online and communities where they're trying to create these standards. And I think that's going to help a lot of enterprise customers because they're going to be, is this according to standards? And that's coming. It's just the market isn't that mature yet.
According to the New York Times and the Mayan calendar, the world is ending in 2012, so hopefully before that.
Totally going to the Mayan calendar, though.
Good, not second, but it helps. Specific questions. One of the questions for the panel is, most certainly, as we see it today, there are a number of enterprise customers out there that are in data centers, are thinking about going into data centers, are thinking about building their own data center, or are thinking about, forget all this, I'm going to go to the cloud for everything. I'm going to pose a question for Don. I think you started to touch on this during your presentation. ABC Co. calls you and says, build me a data center. Forego the trailer for a moment. When do you tell them you're a customer, not a client, having your own data center? Where does it make sense? And you discuss ROI, you talk about feasibility, staffing. I mean, what do you go through when customers approach your company and ask you to do something like that?
So kind of summarizing the question, someone asked us to build them a data center. Okay, this question expanded lately because we acquired another company. We acquired a company called the Technology, which actually has done exactly what you're saying. There's another white paper, white paper 143 that actually I kind of like. And this actually looks at the steps of data center planning. One of the key challenges we find is that the customers rarely fully analyze. People talk about, okay, I want so many watts per rack, and I want to go so many megawatts. And as you dig into those questions a little bit more, you find that in most cases they are the foundation of their interests. Require a whole lot more investigation than what they may put into it. Watts per rack is not a, watts per rack tells you a capacity number for a given point. The diversity of watts per rack in terms of what the high and the low describes what the distribution technologies that you need for power and cooling. And so I think you gave an example where you have enough watts to run a 50 kW per rack solution. You just don't have a distribution technology that will get the power and the cooling to those racks, and you walk away from that business. Okay, is that a fair recollection of what you said before, or is it?
Right. It's a return on investment, a capital expense. I cannot theoretically charge that customer enough to get the return on investment and sacrifice thus what I deliver to the customers. So economically, it's not a great solution for me. So I just like to pass it.
Well, exactly. Now, what limited you is if you knew when you were building the facility at day one that you might have customers that are looking as high as 50, you would have looked at possibly provisioning some distribution technology to take some of the megawatts that you had and make it so you could, or some megawatts of power or the megawatts of cooling, you could actually do that as they need it. Which goes back to the earlier discussion is, you know, this trend toward modularity, whether or not you put it in the parking lot or whether or not you do it as part of your building design. Modularity, and I mentioned before, we've been talking about that for 8 years in terms of how to modularize the internal and external portions of your data center. Kind of, again, going back to the other issue is you get people asking, you know, you dive into the question of, a lot of people say, well, how many dollars per watt are we going to design target toward? And one of the challenges you have there is, again, goes back to, or you build 100% at day one, it may look like you have the cheapest design, but if you don't populate it 100% day one, what you end up having in terms of dollars per watt can be greatly higher. In terms of a whole lot more money you spend on a dollar watt basis, and if you never get there from here, that's a challenge. So I go back to, you know, the challenge facing many colos and any company is, you know, what is tomorrow going to bring? And going back to where we try to help a customer and analyze this is just kind of really ask the questions, how much do you see? And it kind of ties back to the question there, do you see that the regulatory environment's going to change, or do you not? How much respect there is? Do you see that the requirement for latency, is that a geographic requirement, or is that because there's a geographic component of latency, but there's also other designs, and we didn't even touch that that affect latency. So all those issues end up being a very complex statement, of which we, or my team, only looks at a fraction of the answers. We're basically physical people to a large extent with a management overview. And a lot of the discussion we've had right now has been what goes on behind the physical in terms of how the data is actually flowing. Long-winded story, but it's a very complex process to really move beyond the basic questions, and a lot of people try to simplify it, and it becomes very challenging, which is why we have a great partnership with a lot of consultants and a lot of agencies, and why I like talking to Bill and some other people in this room periodically. Straight.
And of course, we try to get our crystal ball out, and it's like, it's not very clear beyond 6 months, a year even.
And that's why the mantra of the industry is scalable, modular, adaptable. It ends up being the nature of the design. Whether or not you put it in a parking lot, which is one way to do it, modules, for some people, 500 kW is the smallest module they ever want to look at. Some people in this room, I'd imagine 500 kW is much bigger than you're ever going to look at. And that's where you'd probably be using more of the services of a hosting provider. Did I cover too much? It was kind of a question.